The greatest military commander in human history is a man you have probably never heard of. He was not Alexander the Great. He was not Julius Caesar. He was not Napoleon. He conquered more territory than Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon combined. He fought in more than 60 pitched battles. He lost only a handful of skirmishes in a career spanning 50 years. He led armies on horseback from the steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Vienna, from the rivers of Russia to the heart of China, crossing more miles in the saddle than any general before or since. He was born the son of a humble blacksmith in a forest tribe of the Siberian wilderness around the year 1175. He could not read. He had only one functioning eye for most of his adult life. He grew enormously fat in old age, so heavy that he had to be carried into battle in a wagon. And from that wagon, with a single eye, he calmly directed the destruction of empires that had stood for 1,000 years. His name was Subutai, and this is how he nearly conquered the world. Using advanced AI trained on the secret history of the Mongols, the chronicles of the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, the records of Chinese and Russian observers, the dispatches of European monks who survived his invasion, and the work of modern military historians who have studied his campaigns the way scholars study Caesar's, we have reconstructed the career of the man who served as the indispensable right hand of Genghis Khan and his sons across half a century of conquest. Forget what a battlefield commander looks like in your imagination. Forget the swords-drawn charge, the blood-flecked plume, the heroic gesture. The man who killed more enemies and conquered more land than any general in history did almost none of it personally. He sat on a hillside or in a wagon, and he thought. He was a man whose weapon was his mind. Subutai was born around the year 1175 in the great forests west of Lake Baikal in what is now southern Siberia, into a tribe that lived by hunting, fishing, and a little trade with the steppe peoples to the south. His family were not warriors of any great fame. By tradition, his father was a blacksmith, a respected craft, but a long way from the world of Khans. When Subutai was a teenager, his older brother went south to join a rising warlord on the steppes named Temujin, a man who would one day take the title Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. A few years later, around the age of 14, Subutai followed. He arrived at Temujin's camp with almost nothing, presented himself for service, and was set to work as a junior man among the warriors of the household guard. What no one yet knew was that the quiet, ordinary-looking young man from the forests had a mind of unusual ferocity. He absorbed everything. He watched the way the Mongol cavalry moved across the steppe. He studied how decisions were made, how scouts were used, how supplies were carried, how enemies were defeated and then incorporated. Genghis Khan, a brilliant judge of men, noticed him within a few years. By the time Subutai was in his 20s, the future emperor of the steppes had begun to trust him with independent commands. By the time he was 30, Subutai was one of the 4 senior generals of the Mongol army, the men known as Genghis Khan's Hounds of War. His first great independent campaigns came in the lands north and west of Mongolia, hunting down remnants of rival tribes that had fled Genghis Khan's wrath. He chased them across thousands of miles of steppe and forest. He developed his lifelong habit of preferring relentless pursuit over decisive battle. Let the enemy run, let them exhaust themselves, let their horses die under them, then catch them when they cannot fight back. By the time he was 40, Subutai had established himself as a master of 2 of the hardest skills in pre-modern warfare, long-range logistics and the patient destruction of fleeing enemies. But the campaign that announced him to history began in 1219, when Genghis Khan turned his armies west. The target was the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and wealthy Muslim sultanate stretching from modern Iran across Central Asia and into parts of Afghanistan. Its great cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Herat, were among the richest and most cultured in the world, and its army was 400,000 strong, larger than Genghis Khan's entire force. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm is one of the most one-sided campaigns in military history. The empire was annihilated in 2 years. Its great cities were stormed and many of them razed. Estimates of the dead run into the millions. And while the rest of the Mongol high command focused on the heart of Khwarezm, Genghis Khan handed Subutai, together with a fellow general named Ogedei, a different mission. Take 20,000 cavalry, hunt down the Shah of Khwarezm wherever he runs, and when that is done, keep going, ride west, see what is there, come home through the steppes. What followed was one of the most extraordinary cavalry expeditions ever undertaken by any army. Subutai and Ogedei chased the fleeing Shah across mountains and deserts until he died alone on an island in the Caspian Sea. Then, with their primary mission complete, the two generals turned their 20,000 riders west and kept going. They rode through the Caucasus mountains, fighting and defeating the Kingdom of Georgia along the way. They burst out onto the southern Russian steppes. They smashed an army of nomadic Kipchak tribes. The Kipchaks fled to their Russian allies, the princes of Kiev and the southern Rus, who assembled a huge coalition army to crush these strange invaders from the east. In 1223, on the banks of the Kalka River in what is now Ukraine, Subutai and Ogedei pretended to retreat. The Russian and Kipchak army pursued them, strung out across the plains over many days. When the lead Russian forces were exhausted and isolated, Subutai turned and destroyed them. Several princes were captured alive. The Mongols built a wooden platform on top of the captured princes and held a victory banquet upon it, crushing them slowly to death under the floorboards. Then Subutai and Ogedei wheeled their tired army around and rode east all the way home, completing a single campaign that had covered more than 5,000 miles of unfamiliar territory and shattered every army that had tried to stop them. It is the longest cavalry raid in recorded history. Genghis Khan died in 1227. His son Ogedei took the throne as Great Khan and almost immediately began planning the next wave of conquests. The veteran commander he relied upon above all others was Subutai. First came the final defeat of the Jin dynasty in northern China, a long and grinding war that ended in 1234 with the destruction of one of the wealthiest empires on earth. Subutai was the architect of the final, decisive campaign. But what came next was on a scale no commander before him had ever attempted. In 1235, the Great Mongol Council met at Karakoram and resolved upon an invasion of the West. The goal was nothing less than the conquest of all of Europe. The nominal commander was a young grandson of Genghis Khan named Batu. The true mind behind the campaign was Subutai, now in his 60s. What happened next is almost unbelievable. In the winter of 1237, in temperatures so brutal that European armies of the day would not have dreamed of marching, Subutai led an army of well over 100,000 riders across the frozen rivers of Russia. The Mongols preferred winter campaigning. Frozen rivers became highways for their horses. The hard ground was easier for cavalry than the spring mud. The European armies that opposed them were utterly unprepared for invasion in the dead of winter. One Russian principality after another fell. Ryazan was destroyed. Vladimir was destroyed. The Grand Prince of the North was killed in battle. In December 1240, after months of careful planning, Subutai's forces stormed the great city of Kyiv, then one of the wealthiest cities in Eastern Europe. The city was reduced almost to nothing, and from the ruins of Kiev, Subutai turned his attention to the next prize. What followed is the part of his career that should be known to every student of military history. Subutai divided his army into multiple columns, each with its own subsidiary commander. He sent them through the Carpathian Mountains into Central Europe along separate paths, each time to arrive at its objective on a precise date. On April 9th, 1241, one column under another Mongol general crushed a combined Polish and German army at the Battle of Legnica in modern Poland. On April 11th, 1241, 2 days later, Subutai himself, with the main army, crushed the Kingdom of Hungary's entire field force at the Battle of Mohi. 2 battles, hundreds of miles apart, won by 2 coordinated Mongol armies on 2 consecutive days after a winter march from Kiev. No European commander of the age could conceive of operating at this speed and this scale. Hungary lay open. The Holy Roman Empire braced itself. Mongol scouts were sighted near Vienna. Pope Gregory IX wrote panicked letters to Christian rulers, begging for a crusade against the new horror from the east. And then, in the early spring of 1242, the Mongols turned around and went home. The reason was political, not military. Word had reached Subutai and Batu that the great Khan Ogedei had died in distant Mongolia. By the law of the empire, the senior princes had to return for the great council that would choose his successor. Europe was saved not because it could fight off the Mongols. It almost certainly could not. It was saved because, half the world away, a single man in a tent had stopped breathing. Subutai turned the army around and rode east. The Mongol assault on the west was over. Western Europe would never quite understand how close it had come. Subutai's career was not yet finished. He served in further campaigns into Eastern Europe and against the remnants of the Song dynasty in southern China, where he continued to refine his methods well into his 70s. By then, he had grown enormous, so heavy that he could no longer ride a horse for long stretches and was carried instead in an iron-bound wagon. Generals half his age came to his wagon to ask his advice and to receive his orders. He died around the year 1248 of old age at his home in Mongolia, far from any battlefield. By that time, the empire he had served had become the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to the Carpathians. A staggering proportion of it had been added to the Mongol realm in campaigns that Subutai had personally commanded or designed. What made him so different from every other great commander? 3 things. First, he understood logistics in a way no European or Middle Eastern general of his age did. He moved armies of tens of thousands across distances his enemies thought impossible, supplying them through forward-pushed depots, captured granaries, the herds of horses that travelled with every Mongol soldier, and intelligence gathered by scouts riding weeks ahead of the army. Second, he treated intelligence as a primary weapon. Before a single Mongol arrow flew, Subutai's scouts and informants knew the size of the enemy's army, the names of its commanders, the politics of its court, the location of its bridges, the time of its harvest, and the bribes that might tip the scale. Third, he understood psychology. The famous Mongol terror, the deliberate destruction of cities that resisted, the merciful sparing of cities that surrendered, was not random cruelty. It was a calculated tool to make later sieges easier. By the time Subutai's army arrived at a new city, that city had often already heard what had happened to the last one that refused. Many opened their gates without a fight. He turned reputation itself into ammunition. So why has history not given him the place it has given Alexander or Caesar? Partly because he wrote no memoirs, and the Mongols themselves left only fragmentary records of his campaigns. Partly because the European tradition that shaped modern military history was the very tradition his armies had nearly destroyed, and it was reluctant to admit how close the disaster had come. Partly because he was not a king or an emperor in his own right. He served a dynasty, faithfully, his entire life, and the glory was given to the Khans whose orders he carried out. And partly because the man himself was not a romantic figure. He was a one-eyed, increasingly obese commander in a wagon who issued careful orders, ate his meals on time, and went home when the campaign was done. No flair, no drama, only the steady, terrifying calculation of a mind that saw warfare as a great problem of arithmetic and time. That was the life of Subutai, the general from the forest who served the greatest steppe empire in history and quietly ran circles around every army he ever faced. He rode tens of thousands of miles. He won battles in Poland, Hungary, Russia, Persia, Korea, China, and the Caucasus. He helped to build an empire that would stretch from the Pacific to the gates of Central Europe. The empire he served eventually fragmented, the descendants of Genghis Khan turning on one another, the great Khanates of the Mongols breaking into rival states that slowly faded into the broader currents of Asian history. But the lessons of Subutai's campaigns survived. Modern military academies still study him. The logistics of his marches, the precision of his coordinated battles in 1241, the use of intelligence and deception, the willingness to march in winter when others would not, all of it remains a masterclass in warfare. The textbooks remember Alexander and Caesar and Napoleon. But somewhere, in the quiet pages of every serious modern war college library, sits the story of a one-eyed fat old man in a wagon who came out of the forests of Siberia and ran a sword across the throat of half the known world.